do depend a lot on the terms we negotiate when we do. So it's an important question. I would imagine that one option would be to try to remain as a member of the European Economic Area. That's to say, to remain in the single market. The first thing I think to be said about that is I think it's most unlikely that the existing members would be willing to allow that unless Britain agrees to continue free movement of people. So migration will continue really as it does today. And I suspect most of the fiscal transfers, the membership fee, if you want to call it that, would also still have to be paid. I think it's difficult to think that those things wouldn't be applied because essentially that would, I think, create problems. If we think a little bit further, the only way in which Britain gets an outstandingly good deal is if we think it has exceptionally strong bargaining power. I find that difficult to believe. Britain is not all that important to the total trade of the EU. Conversely, actually, the EU is far more important to British trade. All the estimates I've seen of the impact of a Brexit suggest that the welfare loss to the UK is relatively high. The welfare loss to the EU is much smaller. I think that suggests to me that it's unlikely that Britain has any particularly special bargaining power. Unilateral free trade would create some welfare gains for the UK on a standard economics analysis. I think most people who've looked at the issue believe those gains are considerably smaller than Professor Minford claims. He claims we could move to an arrangement where we gain something equivalent to 4% of GDP. My guess is the likely range of the gains is well below 1% of GDP. As you probably are well aware, we can often construct a textbook case which says that unilateral free trade is welfare improving for the home population. The issue, I think, with that tends to be, yes, that might be the economics of it, but what about the politics of it? The politics of it, I think, are that some people would be suffering by considerable losses. Minford himself, in his discussion, suggests that a move to unilateral free trade would probably virtually end manufacturing in the UK within 5 or 10 years. Given the fuss that the issues related to Tata Steel have created recently, that doesn't look to me like something which is politically feasible. Moreover, if we are thinking on Brexit of moving to a situation where we start negotiating trade agreements with other non-EU countries around the world, then the difficult way of doing that is on the basis of multilateral liberalisation. And on the whole, the usual argument would be that it's better actually not to liberalise before you conclude the agreement, because actually you've reduced your bargaining power. I think one could easily imagine that something close to 3 million jobs are at present involved directly or indirectly in that export trade. Okay, suppose we have a Brexit, what do we imagine happens? Well, the first thing I think to say is we imagine there will be some sort of trade deal between Britain and the EU. The worst case scenario, I guess, is probably that Britain becomes a WTO member, receives most favoured nation terms from the EU on tariffs, perhaps over time faces increasing trade costs from non-tariff barriers to trade as things like regulatory diversions grow. That will probably reduce the volume of trade compared with a situation where we stay in, but it surely doesn't eliminate the trade or indeed eliminate most of the trade. That, however, would only be the first round effect, it seems to me. Short to medium term, those people who did lose jobs would get re-employed. So that if we ask ourselves, would this change seriously increase something like the natural rate of unemployment in the economy? I think the answer is probably no. And the issue is one of adjustment costs, which I don't want to minimize, there would be some, rather than permanent unemployment for most of the individuals involved. So I think it's quite important just to sort of unpack what is meant by the 3 million and what the consequences are. They're not, I suspect, what the Remain campaign would like the person in the street to believe when threatened with that. Yeah, I think this issue is only partly about economics. On the side of economics, interesting, I hadn't perhaps perceived it beforehand, but as we look at what economists have been saying, they seem to be unusually similar in their comments. There seems to be a higher degree of consensus on this issue than on any major issue I can really think of in my professional life. That doesn't mean we should immediately say, okay, we go along with the economists, but it is interesting to know that that's the case. And I don't think the economists for Brexit are very credible, let's be honest. However, you might want to argue that the issue is that for many people, they are worried about aspects of what they would take to be sovereignty, about decision making, but certainly membership of the EU means we do have less control over certain aspects of our life, if you like, our social life, our political life. I think it's a perfectly justifiable position for someone to say, I value the freedom to run things as we wish highly enough that I'm happy to pay even a significant economic cost. I think that is a perfectly legitimate position. It depends presumably on political outlook, on personal preferences, and I wouldn't presume to advise students about that.